Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Keith Smith, Associate Vice President for Community and Governmental Affairs, and we're so glad to have you here today. We have a special treat for you, a topic that has not been visited in a while, and some would say probably not in this area ever. I don't know. I haven't done the history on it, Dr. Peacock. But today we have a special treat for you. It's a historical element to it. It's the story of Nash County's ties to the first recorded African family in the first permanent British colony in America. Our presenter today, Shelton Tucker, is a world-class financial advisor at Tucker & Associates, a subsidiary of William A. Tucker Enterprises, LLC. Now, through his experience as an expatriate living and working in Europe and Africa, he has spent time exploring the genealogy of his family through primary research. As a professional financial leader and analyst for First Chicago, London, and Coca-Cola Africa, Shelton has honed his investigative and analytical skills to uncover a family history that rivals Alex Haley's roots. He has presented some of his findings with the African American Civil War Museum in Washington, D.C., and to officials of the New Black History in Richmond, Virginia. Sheldon is a graduate of Tennessee State University, Meharry Medical School, with a Bachelor of Science degree in Healthcare Administration and Planning. And he earned his MBA from Clark Atlanta University in Atlanta, Georgia. He is currently working on a book about his family history. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Mr. Shelton Tucker.
Thank you. Hello. Welcome. This is such an occasion for me. We've been working on this for what, 2 years? But I want to thank Mr. J. Peacock for being tenacious and for getting this done. I want to acknowledge your support behind this. Also, thank you, Mr. Keith Smith, for the wonderful introduction. And also, Ms. Faye Calhoun, wanted to recognize, but my cousin is not here, Andre. Andre, he'll probably come in later. And Andre and I met for the first time. Andre and I are second cousins. His mother is here, my first cousin. I want to introduce the Johnson family. Those are my cousins, everybody at that table. And let me tell you, we've got a story to tell you today. How many of you are history majors? Any history majors? Okay. Anybody just interested in genealogy? Okay. Now you've seen from these roots, it's gaining in popularity, and people are starting to look back now because, number one, there's an opportunity to do things online that you couldn't do in the past. And one of the things I wanted to discuss was bringing the pieces of the puzzle together. And I've been at it for over 20 years and trying to put all the pieces together for our family history. And one of the things, if you're a genealogist, I always say, are you an analyst or a data collector? There's a difference. You need to understand the context. You also need to have good reasoning skills. Reasoning skills mean you need to look at everything. You need to look at the economics. You need to look at the religion, what was going on with a number of different factors when you're doing genealogy, because it helps you put things into context. Not believe everything you read, because some of the documents were written for political reasons to hide information, okay? And historical context is always important if you're gonna review. And my key thing, I'm a finance person, follow the money, okay? The money will tell you more than anything about what was really going on. And you'll see that in the examples that I give. Primary resources are best, but they cannot always be found. And that goes back to the first analyst versus data collector. Now, this is me standing in front of, I don't know if you could see that, but it's the Tucker Cemetery, first black family, 1619. How many know about the first black child that was recorded in the United States? Well, he was in the household. I'll tell you a little bit more about that. But this was one of the, when Jamestown had their 400th anniversary, there was a relative by the name of Thelma Williams that actually promoted the firstborn African-American child and the first recorded African family. That's mother, father, and they put baptized child, but we'll cover that later, why it was put that way. Can you hear me if I walk around? Okay. This is a little bit about me. This is my family, my mom, my dad. Can you pick me out? I'm there, the shortest one with the bald head. But my mother, my parents are very important. My father, that's William Tucker. He from Greenville, North Carolina. He married Helen Tucker. This is when we were in Tokyo, Japan, and we were a military family, taken at that time. But I love that picture. It's a nice family picture. This is a little bit about me and my background. As Mr. Smith indicated, it's been a blessing, my career, because I've been able to live abroad. I lived in London, and during that time in London, I had a chance to walk the same streets as my ancestors. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But I also had a chance to visit the motherland and live in the motherland. I've been to 16 different countries on the continent of Africa, working for Coca-Cola Africa. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as well as I go along. This picture was taken during Heritage Culture Day in the Southern Africa office in Johannesburg. And they named me Tepo, that means trust, in Zulu. But as it turns out, in my DNA, I have Lemba as genealogy. And in Lemba, if you know anything about the Lemba tribe, they are part of the lost tribe of Israel. And they're down in South Africa. At the time, I did not know that because I didn't have it done, but certainly if I had done that, I would have visited. This is me in Tanzania, and I also have DNA in Tanzania. Those are Makonde carvings. They carve out of ebony wood, which is the hardest wood known to man. It takes 200 years for an ebony tree to grow. And so they put an embargo on it because they were using them so fast. But their carving skills, they started as an apprentice. It's amazing what they could do with the intricate ebony wood. Okay, now what influenced me to get into genealogy? This young lady is, to the right is my, and to the left, my sister Demetria Tucker. She was the oldest. She has her master's from the School of Library Science. She won an award from the White House for her work. And she also, her name, if you ever go to the School of Library Science at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, you will see her name as a distinguished alumni. She got that award. So we're very proud of her, but I mentioned her because because of her librarian skills, she was able to do a lot of documentation. She used to do it the old-fashioned way, go down to the state archives, pull the data, and it's interesting in data collection process, you can't sit there and read everything, you just have to get broad categories and start scanning, and then afterwards you do your analysis. But she inspired me to this genealogical journey that I've been on, and like I said, analyst versus data collector, I'm the analyst. There he is, the man of the hour, Aundrea. But the data collection part, she's very good at, and I'm good at the analytical part because I've been a financial analyst. I used to have a forensic accountant, and they used to have to find money. So a lot of times you may not have the documentation, you have to make certain assertions. Okay, now guess what I found? This really is such a touching moment for me. because I finally get to tell this to you, and they will remember me. This was a quote. And here are the key resources for the quotes. First Republic, both of them were written by Alexander Brown. Alexander Brown went through primary research documents to pull this information out. And I was sharing with Mr. Peacock that, or Dr. Peacock, I was sharing with him that as an analyst, I don't just read what is written, I read the notes. Guess what I found? What does it say here? It said the president of the company of these colonies have an authority here to take for their benefit any prisoners. Now this letter was written by the Spanish ambassador to Philip, King of Spain, giving him an update on what's going on with the Virginia colony. Because as you know, Spain and England were at odds during that period of time. Spain was under Catholicism and England was basically Protestant. However, King James, his mother was Mary Queen of Scots. She was Catholic. King James actually had a confessor. So he grew up being Catholic, but he had to pledge to Queen Elizabeth that if he was in succession, that he would have to abide by the Anglican Church. But this document here was written to King Philip by his ambassador. And what does it say? It says, the benefit of any prisoner condemned for criminal causes has had some who have preferred hanging to go into Virginia. A few days ago, when they were about to hang some thieves, 3 of them, the soundest and the strongest. Okay, now when they describe soundest and strongest, typically that means they had to do some analysis about them. They just weren't random people, but they said the soundest and the strongest, right, were chosen to go to Virginia. 2 of them accepted, but the 3rd one would not, and seeing 2 returning to the jail, that's a British word for jail, he said, let them go there and they will remember me. Then he urged the hangman to shorten his work, as if he was thus relieved of a greater evil, and thus it was done. Now, the uncanny part of this was that, Aundrea, you remember when we first met, you said you used to have these dreams about being in jail? in an 16th century jail or something of that nature? Had no idea, but this came up. Okay, the second quote says what? First it goes into that sentence I had to kind of, he was telling the same story a second time. And he said, so much so that a person who was present has told me how in the court of the mayor of London, when the case of 2 Moorish Negro thieves came to the mayor, told them, impressing upon them their offenses, that they ought to be hanged, but that taking pity upon them, they should go and serve the king and queen in Virginia. And they replied at once, decidedly and with one accord, that they would much rather die at the gallows and quickly then die a slow death in Virginia. I do not know, at this point, he said, I do not know whether they were sent to Virginia or not. Okay? So he was informing the king. This wasn't just a regular jail case, because this was a letter to the king. What do I remember that statement, because we're going to go back over that. 16th century. There are not many African-American families that could go and trace back to the 16th century. Okay? But I'm going to take you there and show you how I got there. Okay? My key resource for this was Staying Power, History of Black People in Britain. Okay? Now, remember, during the medieval period, there was a man called Mansa Musa, okay? He was a king of the Mali Empire, and when he traveled to Egypt, he left gold wherever he could. So gold was plentiful in Africa, and their skill at mining gold was exceptional. However, later on in the year 1555, this was the era of mercantilism. The UK, or the Britain, was late in the game of communicating and trading with the Africans. The Spanish and the Portugal had already. But in a book, in this same book, there's a quote by John Locke, who was a trader that went to Shama, and that's located in what is now Ghana. And he went on a trading mission because Queen Elizabeth wanted to what? Get gold and compete with the Portuguese and Spain, okay? Now, in that book, they give the names. The British went there, and so the African king at that time said, okay, if we're gonna trade with you, we're gonna send our smartest guys to England. And they went to England. 3 guys, it was actually 5 of them, and it's recorded in the log of the voyage of John Locke, okay? And you see the name here. Records show that John Locke, a London merchant, brought 5 Africans from the town of Sharma in what is today Ghana to London to be trained as interpreters in order to assist England's trade with the west coast of Africa. Okay? So this is very important because what? They list their names. 3 of them. Ben, Anthony, and George, okay, are known to us. The fact that they did not find England weather to their liking, their exact status is not, and in some accounts, they are described as slaves. But it's clearly, when you read through the document, they were not slaves, okay? They were sent over so that they could trade, because there's a later, when they came back several years later, they brought some of them back so they could start the trade. But it said it is clear that if this is the case, they were not enslaved by anyone in England, and 3 of them returned to Africa within months to assist and encourage the compatriots to trade in gold with English merchants. All right? I want you to remember that name, Anthony. Okay? Now, during that period with Queen Elizabeth, you had many Africans that were already there, and they were members of the court. They provided entertainment, they provided, one was a trumpeter, so forth and so on. So they were not foreign. They were called blackamoors during that period of time in England, okay? Now, what is this? What do you see there? That's called the Drayton Metal. You see that? Okay? Now, the reason that African is there is because, and that's a cameo. Cameos are not taken lightly in England, okay? They're very important when they're created, okay? And this was created to show the alliance between the African continent during that time and the British because of the gold. All right? How many of you seen this before? Anybody seen this before? Okay. But it's sitting in the British Museum, okay? Now, let's talk about if the Africans were going over to overseas, who was advising who when it came to tobacco? They had had experience with the Portuguese and the Spanish. They knew the language, and they knew how to, what? Cure and make Spanish-grade tobacco. Okay, now this is about, in Hampton, Virginia, you'll see this sign. There's a first African arrival. They actually arrived Jamestown just this year. No, last year. That's right, it's 2015. Just last year, Jamestown conceded that in the document they arrived in Hampton, Virginia, not Jamestown itself. But as you read this, you will see the name of Captain Tucker. You will see that they recorded what? Anthony and Isabel and their son William. Okay? Didn't I tell you to remember the name Anthony? Okay. Now here's the source for this. It's a book called Merchants and Revolution. It's a very good book. Also, I use for my account, there's the Privy Council records, that's primary research, and Sir Robert Bell, okay? This is Sir Robert Bell. As it proves out, we are descendants of Sir Robert Bell. And the DNA proved out, and also the Robert Bell was the Speaker of the House for the Queen of England, Elizabeth I, okay? He also, his descendants actually migrated to Jamestown, the name Henry Bell, and another one of his descendants was governor of Bermuda, Philip Bell. Now the interesting thing about Philip Bell's daughter married Daniel Elfrith. Captain Daniel Elfrith was the captain of the ship called the Treasure. Anybody know the significance of the ship called the Treasure? You will see in most history that was the ship that was sent out to get the Africans and bring them back. Okay? There, I have document from a well-noted genealogist out of South Carolina named Leonardo Aundrea that proves the relationship between the Bell and Tucker family is pre-colonial. Okay? Now, let's talk about these two characters. That's King James, and that's Count Gondomar. His name was, his last name was Acuna, Sarmiento Acuna, okay? Now everybody, if you read anything about them, they were joined at the hip because they were trying to get through a marriage between the Spanish infant and King James' son, okay? But this document here will tell you what was going on in terms of the religion. There was a religious fight. England had a parliament in their government, but that parliament was being ran by Protestants, primarily. But you still had people on the payroll in England being paid a pension by the Catholic Church. So you had a lot of stuff going on in terms of the politics, and the role of Gondomar was to try to get a marriage done and try to get Catholicism into England, okay? So this Spanish match was a big deal. Now, if you want to read through it on your own, it's online for free, but it takes a lot of reading and understanding. But it was a match. You know, I left off 3 zeros on this slide. In today's currency, that's $250,000 deal. Now here's what went on. King James said, I will marry my son to this Spanish infanta, as they call it. She was an infant at the time. And as you know, they did arrangements back then for marriage. I know some of us probably wish they did something. But anyway, it was all about the money. You remember I told you to follow the money, right? So this was a 600-pound deal that King Philip of Spain promised that they were going to pay if this marriage to England, if this marriage took place, all right? So, guess what? King Philip didn't have the money. So how is he going to get this money? So if you read all of the data, what my assertion is that Gondomar, you remember everybody wanted to know, well, how did John Ralph get that seed to plant that tobacco? because Spain had a bounty on that. If they released that, I mean, the King of England said, we'll behead you if you get that special Verona tobacco to anyone outside of Spain. But John Rolfe happened to get it, did he? You remember? Okay, well, how did he get it? Okay, my assertion is this was an arrangement, because right afterwards, King James decided to patent 7,000 retail tobacco shops, and he decided to tax tobacco. So and all tobacco coming out of Virginia had to go through where? London. Just like in Spain, all the tobacco had to go to Seville. And so what happened, my assertion is, this is how they trumped up criminal charges for those three, because they were responsible for packing meats and bounds and tonnage and poundage. What happened with the King of England, if you didn't weigh that stuff properly and there was shrinkage in tobacco, then, you know, it was a problem. That means he would get less tax money, right? So you really had to know how to cure and pack tobacco properly, okay? Another thing, this is the register of St. Olave Hart Street, okay? The reason I mention that is because, and I mentioned the 7,000, the reason I mentioned that is because, let me come back to this. You probably can't see it. I think I left it out. They registers the baptism and the death, okay? You remember I told you the one that says, remember me, I would rather hang, and they hanged him because it's recorded in that register. They hanged him on the 26th of January, okay? Before they hanged him, they baptized him. So he's listed there, and guess what his name is? Mark Anthony. Okay, Mark Anthony. Okay, so and the dates lined up with that letter in 1616, 1617. The dates lined up and everything. And they normally, it wasn't a child or stillborn or anything because it was only 2 days between the baptism and the burial. Because in those registers, they would record whether the child was stillborn or something like that, or whether it was a child. So his name was Mark Antony. Okay. Now, let's talk about the branding of tobacco. You remember Pocahontas? You remember she went over to England, right? Okay. What was that? That was a sponsored trip. So Virginia could brand their tobacco underneath a new brand called the Virginia Indians. Okay. That was John Rouse. That's why he married her. That's why he brought her over. And what happened during that time is that stuff didn't taste very well. It was not like the Spanish grade tobacco that the Africans were actually doing in Veracruz and the Spanish grade tobacco. So if you look at the Native American account of what happened to Pocahontas, it says she was poisoned. Okay? So we read our accounts. They said, what did our account say? She had pneumonia, and she couldn't put up with the weather, but that deal fell through. This is an illustration of, this is a Virginia Indian on your right, and that's an African on your left. So what was happening is that England had such an appetite for tobacco, but they only wanted Spanish grade. How many cigar smokers we have in here? Anybody smoke cigars? Oh, okay. Okay. Now what do you, now Cuban cigars? Well. See? Right, there's a difference, right? There's a difference, okay? And so when Powhatan, when they had the deals going, they wanted to marry and do it a peaceful way by marrying, the British wanted to marry into the royalty of the Native American and acquire land. okay? But again, the quality of their tobacco was not world-class and Spanish grade. But who knew about it and who knew how to cure that was the Africans. Now this guy here is Sir Robert Rich. He's important because he was the owner of the treasurer. According to the scheme is that we got Count Gondomar. Guess who owned the ship San Juan Bautista? Count Gondomar's family, the Acuñas. Okay, how ironic is that? The Spanish ambassador had this ship that they said had the Africans that were captured through piracy. That was owned by Gondomar's family. Why? Because in the Privy Council records, he testifies. Okay? Now, let's talk about that ship that went out to supposedly pirate the Africans. Okay? It was called the San Juan Bautista. Now, most historians said that they went out there and saw the ship of Angolans, and then they went and pirated and just took 20 of them, okay? 20 Africans, and then they brought them to Virginia, and then some to Bermuda. They even put it out here. There was a Dr. Sluter who published in the Williamsburg Quarterly that they were all Angolans that were captured from a war. There was also Dr. Thornton and his wife also confirmed that there was a war going on, and they went in and captured them. But guess what? As you see here, that ship made it to Veracruz, and it had 283 Africans that they let off at Veracruz. Okay? They started out 350. Total slaves embarked 366, right? They said number of slaves, second place was 25, number of 24. So that's the 20 and odd. You've heard of the 20 and odd? Okay, John Rolfe wrote when that's the source. He wrote that and recorded in 1619 that 20 and odd Africans arrived in Virginia. So that's why in year 2019, you're going to hear more and more about the 400 years of the recorded Africans in the Virginia colony. Okay? Now, were they Angolans? The Angolans were, why were they shipped? Well, why were Angolans important? According to my research, think about it. Most slaves were seasoned before they go over and perform. A seasoning process means you got to get used to the weather, you got to get used to this. If you were not seasoned, even the settlers, you would die probably within a year, okay? So what sense would it make to go and capture some Africans off a boat and then bring them directly over to a Virginia climate, not a Veracruz, okay? So all I'm saying here is that this was a planned event that was planned between Gondomar and King James so that they could get Spanish grade tobacco in the colony, okay? And so if you want more detail on that, you'll get it in the book, okay? But I did want to share, remember, Virginia Company of London was a venture capital firm when they started. They had to send over, they had Frenchmen to come over to develop wine. They had miners. They had the Germans knew how to do the sawmill. And so they didn't need any kind of chattel slavery going on at the time. They needed experts. And that's what, was it piracy or was it planned? John Rolfe's account, Daniel Elfreth, Court of Admiralty, when they had the trial for that captured boat, some of them said there were no Africans on the boat at all. But the bottom line is this. The bottom line is that guess who testified in the Court of Admiralty? The two Africans. Now, the two Africans that testified, one of them was, one African, that was Antonio. So it was Anthony and Antonio. My assertion is that they were brothers, and they were the three, that was their father that hanged himself before he would go to Virginia, okay? Because there was an Anthony, when you look at the mustard, there was an Anthony, and that Antonio became Anthony Johnson. He was the first black landowner in Virginia during the 1600s, okay? So he was a Johnson, y'all. Okay, now a lot of pictures that you see of the Africans coming off the boat, they had them in chains and yada, yada, yada. More than likely that did not happen that way. Because there was an even split between men and women. They were seasoned in Jamaica. They knew the arrangement between the ambassador and them. They had to have the right people there to get that tobacco off the ground. Okay? Now this is Captain Tucker. He was a merchant planter, a seafarer, military. He had the patent on marketing tobacco to England, the sole patent. Okay? So in my research, Anthony was sent to him because he was responsible for shipping and packing that tobacco. Antonio went to Sir Edwin Bennett's plantation, which was because Sir Edwin Bennett was an tobacco inspector, okay, for the Virginia colony. So then back to his tobacco inspector, Antonio knew how to cure it and plant it. That's why he ended up with a plantation of his own, okay? Now this is Captain Tucker's timeline, right? You see this? That's the source. This timeline says that, where is this, Captain Tucker? This is not their actual photos, but this is Anthony advised the packing and shipping. Antonio did the planning. When they had the massacre, anybody remember the massacre in 1622? Anyway, bottom line is when after Pocahontas died, his brother Opechancanough decided, oh, we're gonna wipe out the settlers because now we don't have a deal with the tobacco. They're coming over here doing it themselves, and they brought the Africans over to do it. So when they massacred, they didn't kill any of the Africans, okay? This is Opechancanough. Now Opechancanough, you know, these pictures are sometimes misleading. He was educated in Spain and had a Christian name, Don Louis. Spain tried to settle in Yorktown. They had Jesuits there that tried to start a settlement there. And they tried to cut a deal with the Native Americans during that time with Powhatan. Okay, now this was the muster that was done in 1624 after that slaughter. And as you see in Captain Tucker's household, they've got an Indian in there. They've got a Negro, what is his name? Anthony, and his wife Isabella, and their son William. Notice that they put child baptized. Why do you think they put child baptized there? Two things. Number one, once you were baptized under the British system, you could participate, you know, you anglicized your name, number one. And you were free also, because during that time, even if you were enslaved at the time, once you became Christianized, then they didn't believe in enslaving Christians in the early period before chattel slavery. Okay, now you see Negro here. This is on Bennett's plantation where Antonio is listed, where you see a Negro, Antonio, and then you see his wife, Mary. They came over on what? What ship did Antonio come over? The James. Okay, so he didn't come off that boat, right? Okay, so what I'm trying to tell you is that Captain Tucker sent over two men in 1617 and 1618, and those were the two men that were mentioned earlier that decided to go to Virginia instead of be hanged, okay? That's the monument at the Tucker Cemetery, by the way. So if you ever come to Hampton, you'll be able to see that, okay? So let's go to the 18th century. Now, this was interesting because here's my sources: biography and the Black Atlantic, and then the unmasking of the revolutionary family, and colonial Virginia and their Maryland relatives, okay? And I'll leave my sources with Mr. Peacock. I mean, Dr. Peacock. Okay. But this is a story. Anybody familiar with the Book of Negroes? Okay. Book of Negroes, good. Book of Negroes, it was during the time of the Revolutionary War. And this is the time, family, that I believe our family split. Someone with the black loyalists, someone with the revolutionaries. Jane Thompson Tucker's story is in there, in the Book of Negroes. They're recorded. Notice who's in her family. Hannah Jackson, Nellie Jackson, King Tucker, John Jackson, James Jackson. There was also a Betty and a Dinah Tucker. She wanted to keep the whole family together. Now, I want you to notice the surnames. Those that in genealogy, remember, they had naming patterns back then. The reason they had naming patterns was because they didn't have Social Security numbers back then, okay? So they had to name their kids in accordance, and typical for the British naming pattern is the name of the father. If you're naming the child, you either name it the father, and then the wife names it after her father's, the middle name. Okay, we follow that pattern throughout our family. Okay, but anyway, notice the last name: Jackson, Tucker, Thompson. Guess who Captain Tucker's wife was? She was a Thompson. Her brother was Maurice Thompson. Okay, who his apprentice was a Jackson. Okay, so they all stayed in groups and they migrated in groups. Also, they were Methodists, okay, by religion. You know, Granddaddy was Methodist. They started a church in York Methodist Church. But anyway, it was interesting because when you read her story, she struggled very hard. They had to make a decision whether they were going with the British, because the British were promising freedom, and then they also had to they had some that went with the revolutionaries, okay? You see, Captain Tucker bought all this land. He bought land in Hampton, he bought land in Norfolk, Virginia, okay? And then later, his family migrated to Nash County, North Carolina, okay? Along the Tar River. What was happening in Nash County during that time? You remember there was a treaty between the Saponi Indians, and there was also Fort Christiana. The United States set up a actual fort, and then they Christianized, but there was a peace treaty going on. But they were actually trading with the Indians at the time, and a lot of it was fur trading. Also, they moved out that way because they also had better soil for tobacco. Okay. Now, Thomas Tucker is the son of Captain Tucker. You'll see that here. I wish I had a pointer. I don't know if this has it. But anyway, probably does, huh? Could have been using it. You'll see here Captain Tucker, son. Okay, now if you go up, what did it say? His descendant, there was a Robert Tucker. He was in Norfolk. Thomas Tucker, Norfolk. Thomas Tucker, Deep Creek, but he died in Nash County, okay? His children were Willoughby, Keziah, Thomas, and Elizabeth. Willoughby, what? He was in Nash County, all right? So, you Nashvillians. By the way, I used to live in the other Nashville. You guys are the first. I need your help with this one because Captain Tucker's family migrated in this direction. And when we pull the 1820 census, you see these names here, Benjamin Tucker and Lem Tucker. They were free African American during the time when enslavement was at its height. It was the law of the land. I need to know how they got free. And my assertion is that they traveled with Captain Tucker's family, and over a period of time they had earned their freedom or had their freedom status, but I don't know that for sure. But I really need some. I think Lim is short for William. Okay, why? Because there were other Williams in the area, and this distinguished him. I think that's William Tucker. Okay, so it's in the 1820 census, Nash County. All right, so if you have any Bibles or anything that could, of any of those Tuckers that were here in this area, it would be great to find out whether we could track them since they were free during that time. Okay? But that's the Nash County connection. Okay, next thing. We just had this conversation. Wonderful history. This is, it's sad, but it's wonderful because anybody knows about Potter's Raid. Potter's Raid was when General Potter for the Union went to Rocky Mount to destroy, they were doing cotton and clothing for the Confederates during that time. And then they went over to Tarboro to destroy an ironclad. That's a submarine, okay? And then, and that's my source, by the way, David Norris. And then, guess what? They emancipated, these are our people up in here, folks, okay? Because these were the Africans. They did 1,200 that left Pitt and Edgecombe County to get behind Union lines. And when they did that, they took a route, and the Confederates were gonna cut them off around Falkland, Otters Creek, but in the book, they said it was one black man that helped them get around because Greenville and that area is full of creeks. So they had a blockade set up for them, but they managed to get around it. And as they got around it, they were collecting folk to get 1,200 folks. Unfortunately, only 600 made it across. But they got behind enemy lines. One of the, and this is touching to me as well, one of those, several of my relatives, and I went to the National Archives in Washington, D.C., and pulled the record of Thomas Bell. And he was a boatman. He was from Falkland, okay? So he was 39 years old when he enlisted. He was also a Mason. Now, the Masons during that time were the recruiters for Union soldiers. If you ever read the book by Abraham Galloway, that could tell you how they organized the black soldiers during that time. And they organized according to communities, okay? But they were about to be shot and killed when the Confederates found out that they were organizing the African Americans and setting up this trail. But Potter's Raid, they went in and freed them. It was 25 of them, okay? Now, I mentioned that because, as you can see here, oh, let me do the clicker. Hold on. Yeah. You see that land? This is along Tar River. That's the Bell family's property right there, okay? That's Otters Creek right there. Thomas Bell grew up around here. When I look at the scheduled slave list, his age works out. They were in the Belvoir Falkland area. He, along with the names of men who enlisted, were in Company A, B, and C of the 37th Regiment. Surnames correspond to the diverted route. So they knew what they were doing, you know. They knew how to get around Pitt County to help the Union soldiers. Now, this is his service record. He fought in the Army of the James. He was at Fort Monroe. He was at Deep Bottom. That's where he got hurt. He was in the battles. All these were the battles he was in. Isn't that tremendous? Fighting for our freedom, okay? This was a letter from his, who is that cat? From his officer, I can't read the name right now, Officer Ball, saying that he was a good soldier. He applied for his furlough because he wanted to go home. And why did he want to go home? He had a wife. That is the oldest pictures, ladies and gentlemen, that we have of an ancestor. Her name was Henrietta Bell. She was a free mulatto seamstress, okay? But we got her listed with her, we know who our great, fourth and fifth great grandmothers were, because her mother was a white woman and her mother's mother was a white woman. They're listed in the 1850 census. But guess how many kids she had? 23. Okay? And they were all free. 23 kids, okay? And so for him to go back home, but a couple of those kids, and this is my assertion because the DNA is working out, the first 7 of her kids were by who she lived next door to, which was Benjamin Bell. Because I don't know whether you heard the folklore in our family, the lore in our family, everybody knew that Jolly Bell could pass, okay? He passed for white, okay? And so anyway, this building right here, anybody's been on 33, Route 33? That building was there when that was about 2 or 3 years ago. That was where Dr. Mayo's office was. And that's where your great-great-great-grandfather Thomas Bell got his physical done for his pension, okay? Now, Jolly Bell, Thomas Bell's son, owned property in Plymouth, North Carolina. Anybody know where Plymouth is? Now, Plymouth was one of the worst massacres for the Confederate that they did. They killed the Union soldiers, they killed the black citizens there. It was brutal. But Thomas Bell, son, Jolly Bell, bought some land there. And it's still there. He was the tobacco man. This is me and my sister and my cousin on his property. He bought 115 acres that we still have in the family. The cemetery is there, okay? That's the tobacco barn. That's Jolly Bell Jr., his son. And that's an old tobacco barn. How many of you seen? I'm sure some of you in North Carolina, I know you've seen tobacco barns. But it's still on the property, okay? Now, I mentioned spiritual emancipation because we had a great-grandfather, Austin Flood, that helped start St. Paul's Missionary Baptist Church in Tarboro, which is still in existence today. Then, on top of that, we had another relative. Whose name do you see right here? John Bell. John Bell passed to get this church done for the black folks. He was from Pitt County, and he moved to Fairfax. He passed up there too and set up the first mulatto community in Fairfax County. Okay? Now, we were talking about during that period, there was also a lot of reconstruction going on. There was a Farmers Alliance that was being put together, and I have articles with my great-great-grandfather, okay, leading the Republicans at that time, the party of Lincoln during that time. This was our great-grandfather, James Tucker. Oh, sorry. Oops. Oh, let me go back. James Tucker. He owned land right there on the Tar River, First Ward. He was a commissioner back in 1896. Okay, that was that land Granddaddy got taken away during the urban renewal. Now this is one of the oldest pictures. They were enslaved. This is the Reeves. Okay, that was Grandmama Amy's parents. Okay, they were part of the Reeves plantation. Okay, that near Penny Hill up in that region. Okay, her name was Queen Victoria Johnson. Okay, so she's a Johnson as well. Okay, now how many people have 3 generations of their grandmothers in one picture? This is Retha as an infant. That's great-grandmama Amy. And that's her mother, Queen Victoria. Okay? 20th century. That's Grandmama Amy and her husband, Willie Bell. Now, how many of you remember Bell's Diner? Anybody remember? It was on Dickerson Street. It was very popular. He was the first Coca-Cola distributor, black Coca-Cola distributor in Greenville. Now, isn't that beautiful? This is our grandmother, isn't that? And her eyes have been transferred to each one of these beautiful women you see here, okay? Retha Bell. My mother said when she was having my sister, Demetria, that the nurse that attended her was a white lady. She said, is your husband's mother was the prettiest woman in Greenville. Okay, and I believe that. She's beautiful. That's my grandfather. What? Robert Lee Tucker. All right, cigar man. Okay, we kept tobacco in the family. That's your mother. That's your grandmother. Isn't that wonderful? She was a beautiful woman. My father used to always talk about how beautiful Aunt Virginia was. Yes, indeed. And that's all of them together at a family reunion. But I want to talk about our military history, because our military history goes all the way back. We went to the Civil War Museum. My Uncle Bob was in World War II. And this is my dad, William, and he'll tell you William A. Tucker, okay? Now, the uncanny thing about my dad, I think my dad is an amalgamation of what the first Anthony did, because he was shipping and cargo. That's my parents now. Don't they look great? They're in their 80s. Yes, he's a World War II vet and Vietnam vet. That's him. He went in at age 14, and then he came out and then went back into the... But here's what I wanted to say. This was a picture. This is the first time on the Virginia Magazine that we had and I'm about to wrap up, that we had a black man on that cover. And that black man is William Tucker. And the uncanny thing is that he was also part of the first group of loadmasters for the Air Force, for the C-130. So cargo and shipping and tobacco has transferred through our family for generations. This is when we went to the African American Civil War Museum. You see that burial flag? That was Willie Bell. He was in the Spanish-American War. And my father is World War II and Vietnam, holding the flag. And then we did the story of Thomas Bell, who was in the Civil War. So we have a strong military history. This is a salute my dad got from the president for his service. Had the opportunity to meet him as well. DNA, real quick. DNA, this is our DNA match. 30, I got Ivory Coast 22, my dad's match. But guess what? This is a relative. It pops up. Anybody on Ancestry.com, by the way? Anybody else had their DNA done? Okay. Right. With Ancestry.com, they have a program where your matches for your DNA will pop up. And I start seeing all these white people popping up. You know, we're all related. We're all related around here. And guess who he's related to? Captain William Tucker. Okay? So I encourage you guys to, I know it's any questions that you have about me and my research. Yeah.
I know we're wrapping it up real quick, but this young man here had a question for about 3 months, right?
It's okay. I'm satisfied.
You good?
You said, okay, good.
But once again, that's great information, and as I said, timely, to be honest with you, even though we typically celebrate Black History Month in February, here on our campus, we prefer to call it Diversity Month, because as you illustrated there with all of the DNA and different backgrounds, different people, you know, we all connected some kind of way, so we prefer to call it diversity. But thank you so much for
Sure.
that information. And I can see the resemblance here between you and Andre, and certainly you look like your grandmother, your great grandmother for sure.
Yeah.
So this is great information and timely information.
Okay.
And as I said, on one side of my family, I've traced back certainly to the Civil War era, but on the other side of my family, we are scattered all about. So I'm still
Okay.
trying to piece that together. And it's, I guess the older we get, the more we want to know about where we came from and all those good things.
Right.
But thank you so much for that
Sure.
information. And,
Sure. Thank you. Thank you. And I'll let you guys know. Matter of fact, I'll come back for a book signing. All right. Thank you so much.